In this module, we're going to finish up our discussion on digital image processing. Please make sure you're reading the instructions with this module. There are very specific reading instructions assigned that skip a significant portion of the chapter where the author goes into a lot of information on frequency processing, which may be pertinent to other modalities, but not necessarily pertinent towards general X-ray. Just to give a very brief overview of frequency domain processing, large objects produce long waves and lower frequency, which produces less detail. Then smaller objects do just the opposite, producing short waves and a higher frequency, which provides more detail. This type of processing is more specific to MRI, but you can take some info away from looking at the waveform patterns here as the image compares MTF, or modulation transfer function, and spatial frequency domain. We'll get into MTF more, but just know that the higher the MTF, the better the spatial resolution. We're just examining the frequency in the waveforms here. The one at the top has a low frequency, meaning the number of peaks in the waves per given amount of time is lower compared to the second line, where the number of peaks has increased significantly. Let's assume the entire waveform here from start to finish occurs in 1 second. The smallest object, represented by the bottom waveform, has the highest frequency when counting the number of peaks per second. Multiscale processing is a type of filtering, and basically what this does is divides the image into 8 or more frequency bands, or sections, which allows the computer to make very specific changes to each subsection. If you've ever played around with Photoshop or any other similar photo editing software, you can think of each of these sections kind of like layers, where each individual section can be manipulated independently of the others. You can divide the image into high and low frequency sections, so your images can target low frequency structures. Remember, that's larger parts within the body to be enhanced or suppressed. Just remember that the lowest frequency layer is going to have the fewest pixels. But you can see how advantageous it might be to have the ability to visually enhance body parts that give off different signals and suppress others when the radiologist is attempting to visualize very specific anatomy based on the reason for the exam. So why do we need to use multiscale processing? Let me just point out that all of this occurs within the software, meaning you don't have control over this function at the control panel necessarily. Philips Healthcare, AGFA, Fuji, and Carestream, formerly known as Kodak, all use proprietary software with their systems, whether they use frequency versus spatial domains. As I was beginning to explain though, the benefit of multiscale processing is that it allows a single layer of the image to be boosted or amplified for that specific tissue type to be better visualized. It could be suppressed or visually reduced if that isn't the anatomy of interest. Or you could entirely remove a layer if all it's doing is limiting visibility of the layers that might be important for diagnosis of a particular type of exam. And also each layer can be manipulated with edge enhancement or smoothing at the end of the process to amplify the visibility of the tissue you're trying to see. There are 2 types of filtering in the frequency domain: low-pass filtering and high-pass filtering. If you are low-pass filtering an image, you're keeping all of the lower frequencies in the image, and you filter out the high frequencies. Low frequencies will be allowed to pass through the filter. Smoothing is an example of low-pass filtering, and the image is going to appear more blurry. This needs to happen when the original image is too sharp or has too much contrast. We reduce noise by smoothing the image, but the disadvantage is that we do lose resolution. The opposite happens in high-pass filtering, where the computer keeps the high-frequency signals, or the high-detail portions in the image. In high-pass filtering, the high frequencies are allowed to pass through the filter. This is applied when you perform edge enhancement. The image will contain a bit more noise, but it will appear more sharp and very high contrast. Here's a great example of a cat photo where you have the original image on the left and then each technique applied. The middle image has the high-pass filtering effect where all of the high-frequency signals are kept, which means smaller objects, and you see higher contrast with a little bit more image noise or graininess. The image on the right has been softened or has kept the low-frequency signals. This just smooths the image out. It reduces the noise and the contrast. How does kernel size affect filtering? Please make sure to watch the videos in the module about what is a kernel and how does kernel processing work in the real world. Those do an excellent job of explaining what a kernel is and will serve as a good background. A kernel is basically an operating system inside the software that divides the image into high-frequency signals and low-frequency signals in the spatial domain. It's going to function similarly for general X-ray to allow some of the frequencies pertaining to specific anatomy to be enhanced or suppressed in the spatial domain instead of the frequency domain. The kernel size must match the anatomy being imaged. If it's too small, then it may remove details from the image that might be pertinent. So what's the difference between spatial and frequency processing operations? Spatial processing are operations that attack pixels on the image, based on the pixel's locations within the image matrix. In frequency processing, the operations attack the frequency bands to filter the image. Here it focuses on the size of the structure being imaged, not the location as in spatial processing. In your reading, you're going to want to focus on the portions which apply to general X-ray and note the differences between high and low frequencies.